check. Anybody out there? Give me a sound check. I think it's okay, but somebody give me an indication. All right. We've got Dorian Snyder out there. Welcome. Brent Henneberry, welcome. Local guy. Striker, always here. The Stoic, welcome everybody. Thurgood, welcome everybody. It is April something. 8th, 9th, 8th. April 8th. I should know it's April 8th because April 7th, we went into lockdown again. You can't trust people to do the right thing, and people are bored of COVID now. They don't listen anymore. They're not scared of it anymore, and they don't care what's happening in hospitals. So what can you do? But the government has to lock everyone down again. I gotta say, this lockdown is very much different from the one last year. Last year, the place was empty. The streets were empty. No traffic. Nobody was outside. Everybody was scared. Now, it's like business as usual. You just less places you can go. But it's a pretty different atmosphere. In any case, this lockdown is pretty severe. We won't be doing any games. Can't have anybody over. And so we'll carry on with our usual COVID programming. So welcome everybody. Hope everybody's staying safe at home. And if you're doing well, then that's great. And tonight we'll be doing Tactica episode 53 and doing our deep dive on Sisters of Silence. I believe this will be the last deep dive. I think possibly there may be one more on the two big flyers. But other than that, we will be done, and we won't do them again until something significant changes. Usually when we get our codex, that will be the next time we'll go through all the units individually. But I'll be trying to bring you more matchup episodes like the one we had last time with protocultures. I hope people enjoyed that. And we'll be talking about other things as well. And of note, next week we have a great podcast scheduled for you. We will be interviewing Steve Jall. In case you haven't heard of Steve, he burst onto the scene recently with a series hosted by Frontline Gaming called 40K Game Changers, and it's a great podcast to listen to. He's got a real radio voice, literally, and he basically interviewing people who've kind of doing unique things in the game, and it's a nice fresh take on the 40K podcast. So do check out Steve's podcast called 40K Game Changers, and it's part of the Frontline Gaming Network. You can find it on YouTube as well. And we'll be talking to Steve next week. I'm super excited about that, and so that'll be very cool. All right, quick hobby update. So I've actually been doing quite a bit of hobby recently and taking my time and going very slowly. And I'm working on my Deathwing. And so basically it took me all week just to paint in the silver bits and do all the edging on the silver and also on the black armor panels. And so next I'll be putting some color on these guys. I got the sort of purple sword handles there. I'll be putting some color on the bone and the red and the white. And these guys will be looking pretty cool, hopefully. And the other thing I did this week, very quickly, because I can't be bothered to do it spend too much time on it these days, is my second Telemon is done. I have to come up with a name. Bertha's the first one. I think this will be Boris, and Doris will be the third one. But the third one's on its way, finally, from Forge World. And this second one is done in a very quick fashion, although the base is, I'm still waiting for the marble base to come from Dragon Forge. So there is Bertha's sister done. All right. Tonight, let's get into it. We'll be talking about Sisters of Silence. And we'll be talking about Sisters of Silence exclusively from the Talons of the Emperor point of view. I guess any Imperium army could take a vanguard of sisters. Not sure why you would do that, but you could. But we won't really be talking about that. We'll be talking them as part of Custodes / Talons point of view. So the sisters are interesting. Obviously, the lore of the Sisters of Silence is very cool. You know, they're all pariahs or blanks, and so they go around the universe in their black ships and collect up all the psychers and bring them all to Earth and probably feed them all to the Emperor. But they're kind of always been partnered with the Custodes as part of the talons of the Emperor, and you will frequently find in the lore guardians, custodians going around doing their thing, accompanied by a Sister of Silence who gives them that psychic support. And they're usually, like the Custodes, they work in these individual models. They're all supposed to be expert swordsmen, and of course they are blanks. And so it's pretty cool lore. The sisters, I believe, were released in 7th when the Custodes first came out. And people, they did see some play back then. And that's one reason why I even have any sisters, because I bought them way back then. And I think, I can't really remember, but I think people used to splash them for psychic defense. Because back then, other than the Collexes, you know, it was like a big deal. And so that's when sisters first came out. They didn't see any play in 8th because they didn't really get any rules in 8th to make them usable. And then with War of the Spider, we've been starting to see them played here and there, almost exclusively with Custodes. And so that's what we'll be talking tonight, is should we be seeing more Sisters of Silence, and what might we see in the future with Sisters of Silence. And I think they're an interesting little kind of sidearm of the Custodes Codex. Let's just call it like it is. It's a sidearm of the Custodes Codex. And I think there are some interesting ways of using them, and so we'll be covering those tonight. On the surface, it looks like their only role for Custodes is as psychic protection. And while they do bring some aspects of that to Custodes, I actually feel like that's not the reason to play Sisters of Silence. And so hopefully, if people haven't been trying them, people might decide to try them out after tonight. Okay, we will also talk about Aleya. She's over there hanging out with her boyfriend, Christopher. And we will talk about her at the end when we finish the deep dive. And just a short segment on Aleya, which is that special sisters model that came with the book that was released a while ago. We'll talk about her at the end. And we won't be talking about any of the other non-40K sister stuff because it doesn't exist in 40K. But I know there's a couple questions about that in the Discord. We'll get to that. Okay, so as usual, the deep dive starts with models. Okay, so the models are GW plastic. They're nice models. They're small, you know, so if you compare it to a custodian, you know, they're small, like they should be. They're the proper scale for normal, unaugmented humans. Because, of course, they are humans, by and large. They're not superhumans like Marines. They are normal humans and mortals. And so the models are nice. And they're very detailed. They got the nice little fur capes and nice armor. Lots of edging and stuff to be done. And they got these heads and with the masks and the scarves and everything. Anyway. Now, they are some of the most fiddly models to assemble. Because they're small models. And their arms and legs are super spindly, very skinny. And so they real pain in the butt to assemble. And don't make the mistake that I made, and I still remember this mistake years later, is all the arms looked about the same. So I cut them all off and then tried to put them on the models, and it was a nightmare. They actually are very specific and follow the instructions. Don't cut them all off and just think they all fit together, because they don't. So don't make the same mistake I did. I think other than Spirit Hosts, these were some of the most painful models I've ever assembled. So don't make the same mistake I did. Of course, the No Maiden Rhino is just a standard Rhino box, and you have to make it special to make it a No Maiden. I don't know, you know, painted gold or bronze, whatever. But there's no special model for the No Maiden Rhino. We will be talking about the Rhino as well tonight, and we'll be inserting bits about the Rhino in there when we have it. Okay, let's move on. So, the first thing we talk about, as usual, is role and keywords. So, at this point, we're going to talk about the talents of the Emperor rule. And basically, the talents of the Emperor rule allows you to take two things. First of all, you can sisters have a rule that allows you to take them as a vanguard because they're elite. And you could take 3 units of sisters with no HQ, and that's a vanguard. You don't get anything for doing that, and I believe you still pay your 3 CP. So really, it's kind of crappy because they don't have an HQ, and in their wisdom, they never gave us an HQ. Now, as part of their integration into Talons of the Emperor with War of the Spider, we can Custodes detachment can take Sisters of Silence units in their detachment using all the usual slots without ruining any of your rules. There's no cross bestowing of rules. There's almost very little synergy between the two. It's just literally a thing that was tacked on to the Custodes book. And so that's one of the big complaints, is that the sisters were not really integrated into Talons. They were just kind of stuck onto the Custodes book, and there's very little cross interaction. The other interesting thing is this issue of, can you take the Rhino, which is a Sisters of Silence unit, and just use that without taking the Sisters of Silence models, without taking the girls? Can you just take the cars and not the girls? And so raw, yes, you can, because it says you can take Sister of Silence units, and the Rhino is a Sister of Silence unit. And this has always been waiting for FAQ, and I have new inside information from people in the know that this question has been ignored by GW. And when they ignore questions, they usually feel that those questions shouldn't be questions at all, and that it's quite clear. And so I think what we can say, and how I'll treat it from now on, is that it was clearly intended that you can just take Rhinos and no sisters. And so go ahead. Try it out. And I might try that at some point, maybe like 3 or 4 Rhinos. Of course, in order to take a dedicated transport rule says you can only take 1 for each infantry unit in your detachment. So of course you still have to have the infantry for the number of Rhinos, but that's not too difficult these days. And so it would be interesting to play a list with like 3 or 4 Rhinos, empty Rhinos, running around, helping you screen, move blocking, do a lot of things. We'll talk about uses of Rhinos in a bit. Okay, so role. So quite possibly the worst part of Sisters of Silence is their battlefield role, and that they are elite slot. There's no real reason for them to be elite slot. They're not particularly elite, and they just come in 5 to 10 model units. And probably GW did that because they did not want us to be able to fill patrols and battalions at minimal cost. And because that would kind of throw the internal balance of the whole Custodes Codex off a little bit, to be able to get cheap chaff in an otherwise very low model count elite army. And so in their wisdom, they are elite slot, and that makes them very difficult to fit into some lists. And so basically, and the other thing is they did not give us single models in terms of HQs. So we don't have any HQs despite having Aleya. There's reasons why we can't use her. So we have no HQs to just splash a single sister in either. So we have to take them in batches of at least 5 in the elite slot. And the problem is the elite slot is very full of things. It's the slot where the Vexilla sits. All your Terminators are elite, and now, very popular, all the Dreadnoughts are elite too. So if you want to run sisters, you're generally running either skipping out on those things, or you're running at least a patrol, probably a battalion. And then, so now you're paying HQ tax, maybe a troop tax, just to take sisters. So it's actually quite difficult to get sisters into your list unless you design around that as a whole. And of course, taking a Vanguard Sister doesn't help you because you're paying 3 CP for it. So, and that's totally not worth it. So that is, I think, the biggest thing that prevents Sisters from seeing more play. And also one of the biggest things that I hope that they fix is this whole elite slot business. And there's a number of ways they can get around that without making them troops. But, that is a problem. Okay. So, in terms of squad size, so they can be taken in 5 to 10, I believe, all 3 units. And there's probably no real reason to take more than 5 of them. you're usually using them for duties that can be done by a minimum size squad of 5. They're not doing a lot of damage in any phase. And you don't want to eat blast because they're so weak in terms of eating firepower that the extra damage from blast probably negates the points that you've paid for extra models. So probably, unless you're running like a big block of great swords for a melee brick, you're just going to run 5 models, min units of these, and keep the points cost down, because you don't want to be throwing away more points on T3 models in a Custodes army. So that's probably what I would say on squad size. All right, keywords. So of course, the girls are infantry, and that's one of the best keywords in the game. Allows terrain interaction, allows all sorts of advantages, allows you to do actions, which is one of their key uses. So being infantry, great. Sisters of Silence keyword is useful obviously for their specific stratagems, but otherwise there's nothing in the Custodes book that cues to the Sisters of Silence keyword, so it really has no use outside of their own little rules page. Interestingly enough, I just noticed today that they have Astra Telepathica keyword on all their data sheets. Now this doesn't give them anything, and I looked through kind of Guard and Inquisition and where else, and Sisters, and where else we might find Astra Telepathica, and nothing really cross synergizes. There's no cool tricks there, unfortunately, but it's interesting that they have that keyword. And then of course there's the Rhino, which is a Rhino keyword, Null Maiden, a Rhino keyword as well, and it is a vehicle and all that those pros and cons bring, and so it's fairly standard. So nothing too crazy in the keywords. Infantry obviously is the important one. Okay, let's go talk about their stats. So let's talk about the Rhino first. A Rhino is the standard Rhino. So, T3, T7, 10 wounds, 3-up save, no invuln, ability to heal itself on a 6-up. So 12-inch move, your classic can carry 10 people. So that's your classic Rhino chassis. Nothing special about it. It no longer has no maiden rule or anything. So nothing useful there. Doesn't have an invuln, and at the end of the day, a Rhino is pretty much melt-a-bait these days. But if you want to take a Rhino out, you need to commit some amount of melta to it. You have to make a small commitment at least, especially if you pop smoke and -1 to hit. You do have to make a small commitment to popping a Rhino, and it's that knife edge that the Rhino sits on, which makes it teeter between useful and useless. And I think it just teeters just a bit to the useful side in most cases. But against certain armies, obviously, it's going to be fairly useless, like Sisters with a whole bunch of Melta, for example. But against a lot of armies who don't have things like Melta, your Rhino can prove to be difficult to handle, especially if you have multiple of them. And especially if you hide them for the first couple of turns while you're taking care of their anti-vehicle shooting. So it doesn't really have much usability in terms of shooting or anything, but as a box that's T7, 10 wounds, it can be very useful. So that's a stat line that's useful. Okay, Sisters of Silence have a very interesting stat line, which I feel like GW kind of like put it middle of the road to not make them too good, not make them too sucky, as we'll see when we talk about comparators. So first of all, they move 7 inches, which is great. And most people don't realize this. They just assume that these girls move 6 inches, but they're dancing around and stuff. So they move 7 inches, which is great. That extra inch comes in very handy when you're trying to extend your screen, or trying to get onto objectives, or you're trying to extend your 18-inch anti-psyker bubble. 7-inch move is better than 6-inch move. Ballistic skill 3, weapon skill 3 is standard, and it's fine. Apparently, Sisters of Silence are some of the best swordsmen or swordswomen in the universe. That's certainly the impression you get in the lore. So it would have been nice if they could have been weapon skill 2. Or at least the sword girls, the vigilators, could have been weapon skill 2. But alas, they are not. So weapon skill 3, fine. So as a unmodified human, Strength 3, T3 is pretty much standard, so can't really argue against that. 1 wound again for unmodified humans, so pretty standard. Now, 2 attacks is okay. It's better than 1 attack, but it's not great. And 3 for the superior. And again, it would have been nice if the sword girls got an extra attack or something. But 2 attacks as standard. Now they have 3-up save because they're power armor, no invuln, and no feel no pain or anything like that. Standard defensive stat line. Now, obviously, it'd be nice if they got an invuln or some benefit from Aegis of the Emperor as part of a Talon's detachment. That would have been a nice bit of cross interaction. 6-up invuln, 5-up invuln. I mean, like something, a feel no pain or some kind of cross protection, but unfortunately that didn't happen. Now at T3, 3-up save, 1 wound, they're not going to survive most of the firepower that comes our way these days. Very crappy firepower will take them out. Lasguns will take them out. However, don't underestimate a unit of girls sitting in cover at 2-up save. Just saying, in my surprising own play experience, they can survive more than you think if they get that 2-up save. Like with most things with 2-up save. So, and then your opponent is tending to just throw incidental. They're just throwing incidental or leftover shooting. So the big guns go there and the crappy little guns go on the sisters. And so they tend to survive that on a 2-up save. So sometimes the opponent realizes too late that they got to throw real firepower into them to kill them, and then it's your advantage. And of course they can just hide out behind a rune or something. So don't underestimate that they can survive sometimes. But if your opponent wants to kill them, they will die. Like T3... 3-up save, 1 wound just does not survive these days, like anything. And only 5 models as well. So keep that in mind. Okay. Shooting. Okay, so shooting-wise, so the prosecutors are the bolter girls, and the witch seekers are the flamer girls. And unfortunately, both of their weapons got left in the Dark Ages of 8th. So they don't get any modifications to their bolters or rules to alter their bolters. So they literally still have normal strength 4 AP0 1 damage bolters. And then their flamers, while they're longer range now like other flamers still suck. AP0 strength 4 1 damage. So their shooting is nothing to write home about, and really that's probably not why you're taking them. And, hitting on 3s, it's just like, it's like old Marines used to be, right? Very underwhelming, especially these days. Now, there are some exceptions. The other thing they can shoot is psych-out grenades. They can throw these anti-psycho grenades, which basically are pretty useless. They're strength 2 AP0 1 damage. So basically you're not doing anything. All you're trying to do is fish for 6s to do the odd mortal wound, and this is only at 6-inch range. So, and this is only against demons and psychers as well. So really, I mean, these grenades are pretty much useless, and they're just useless. If you get the odd 6, you're like, woohoo, that was fun, but they're pretty useless. Okay, so if we're talking bolter girls, though, they do have use against psychers with the punishment fire stratagem, which we'll talk about in a bit. But that's about it. The flamers suck, and otherwise bolters suck. Okay, now the Rhino just has a storm bolter again, and this is a plain storm bolter with no bells and whistles, and as a 5-point option can take a hunter killer missile. I think if you have 5 points left over at the end of your list building, you would do much worse than throwing a hunter killer missile on your Rhino. The only problem is you got to remember to use it. And it may do good stuff, it may do nothing for you because it is hitting on 3s and usually wounding on 3s. So don't expect much for your 5 points, but often we have points like that left over, and it's better than just throwing a dagger, which you'll also forget to use on somebody. So, and don't forget, the Rhinos can have smoke launchers, and that is key to their survivability, that you time your use of smoke launchers when you really need them to survive, because that -1 to hit is key to their survival. So the Rhino, not a shooting powerhouse at all. Okay, so melee. As already stated, hitting on 3s kind of sucks. If there was some kind of strat that make the sword girls hit on 2s, that would have been cool, but we didn't. So the vigilators are the sword girls, and unfortunately they get no particular stat or buffs or rules to indicate that they are the sword wielding girls. So they still have only 2 attacks base, and there's weapon skill 3. Now the sword is pretty good. It's strength plus 2, so it's strength 5, minus 3 AP, D3 damage. Embarrassingly, that's almost as good as the Guardian Spear. It's only 1 strength worse than the Guardian Spear. And these guys have a +1 to wound strat, the swords. So the difference between strength 5 and strength 6, especially with a +1 to wound strat on board, not that great. So really, I mean, these swords are almost as good as the Custodian Spears, which is embarrassing for the Guardians. And quite frankly, it's a little bit ridiculous. But anyway, it is good for them. And it will be very interesting to see in the new book whether this goes to flat 2. I can't see in any universe them going to flat 3 damage, but will they go to flat 2 damage for these girls? In which case, that would be very intriguing. So a unit of 5 puts out 11 attacks, weapon skill 3, strength 5, minus 3, D3, or let's say in the future, flat 2 damage. That could be fairly good. And of course, they can be delivered, because they have no other way of delivery, it can be delivered in a Rhino. They're kind of like our crappy version of Repentia. Not even close, but, take it as it is. So that's very interesting. And of course, you could put a block of 10 girls in here, which makes for 29 times 2, 18, 21 attacks. So that is a little bit compelling. Now, in an army full of melee potential, it's not particularly exciting, it must be said. And once they get hit back, they're just going to melt. But it's interesting, and it maybe synergizes with one of their strats, which we'll talk about later, in a reason to run girls in a Rhino who can do a little bit of melee damage. Okay, abilities and rules. So we'll talk about the Rhino. Basically, the Rhino repairs on a 6 every turn. If you remember to do that, I don't think I've ever, since using Rhinos, since Lion's Blade Strike Force days in 7th, when I had 8 Rhinos, I don't think I've ever healed a wound on a Rhino with that rule. Anyway, the hope lives on. The Rhino gets no other rules other than the explosion and the smoke launchers. So doesn't get the No Maiden rule, doesn't get any of that. A Rhino with a no Psychic Abomination would be pretty sweet. So that would be cool. Unfortunately, no. Okay, so the all sisters get the following rules. So they all get to reroll wounds against Psychers. So fine, that's a nice rule. Niche. Obviously, it's their niche, so at least they have their niche. And when it does come up, like with Bolter Girls and Punishment Fire Stratagem, it can be pretty good. So you got these girls who you turn their bolters into Assault 3 bolters. They are now can shoot these Psychers even if they're not the closest model, and then you reroll all your wounds against them. Strength 4, most human Psychers say being T4. That's not bad. You're putting out a bunch of shots and you're wounding with rerolls and you're forcing saves. Now it's AP 0, 1 damage saves, so unless you're shooting at a Primera Psyker or something, like a Guard Psyker, unmodified human Psyker, it's not. I don't think it even kill like a Marine Librarian, but it's still forcing saves. If you can get the Psyker down to 1 or 2 wounds, you make them think twice about rerolling psychic tests and stuff like that. So that can be important to put those Psychers down a little bit. Okay. Obviously, if your sword girls get into combat with a Psyker, rerolling the wounds with those swords is super sweet. And I guess even a bunch of flamers rerolling wounds might do something. But yeah, so sword girls and bolter girls with punishment fire rerolling wounds is a nice one to remember against Psychers. Okay, Psychic Abomination is the standard rule. So this is the where they cannot be targeted by psychic powers. And so obviously if they're the closest unit, then you can't smite anything because you can't smite them. And so, that's all great. They also give a -1 to cast and deny within 18-inch bubble, and this is cumulative up to -4. So while all this is good, in reality, it's hard to make a big impact with that. Except in like mid to late game, if they're still alive, like, and everything's just kind of mixed up in the middle, and people forget about these bubbles. In the first part of the game, where your armies are still not kind of mixed in the middle, a good player with a psychic heavy army can easily avoid 18-inch bubbles. And so in reality, it just doesn't work that well. If you're lucky, you might get 1 -1. And these armies that you're trying to use this against usually have lots of buffs that are cast and denies and stuff. And they don't care about your -1. And if you're trying to put your girls out in front of your army to eat smites, they might succeed for one psychic phase, then be gone. And some armies, like Grey Knights, for example, can just shoot them first in the psychic phase and then continue to smite you off. So, and they will die to shooting like that easily. So that whole plan of putting them out front to eat psychics doesn't end up actually working. That would be so different if this thing had Psychic Abomination, but it does not. So in the end, and we'll get to this at the end, their psychic protection is there. It's good. There's some strats too, but it's not, I don't think that's their be all and end all, and they probably don't end up doing that much psychic protection. So, because that rule is just lackluster. Like if that rule was a 24-inch bubble, that automatically makes it that much better, because a lot of things are 18-inch to cast. So like that would have meaningful impact, just that extra 6 inches. But the 18-inch thing is like, they're not sitting on your front lines, and yeah, it just doesn't work out that well when you're trying to do it. All right. The other only other special rule that they have is only on the prosecutors, so the bolter girls, and they have prosecution protocols. So this is the rule that allows the bolter girls to shoot psychers characters even if they're not the closest model. So this is pretty spicy. I mean, normally, putting 10 shots on them in rapid fire range, but then you throw punishment fire stratagem on them for a CP. So now they're shooting 15 shots at assault, so they can even move, advance, and then pop this off and then still shoot now, although they're only hitting on 4s then. But so that's 15 shots in, hitting on 3s. And then, as I say, they reroll wounds against psychers. So now you're forcing a bunch of saves. And as I say, if you can get that psycher down to one or two wounds, then you're making them think about things like psychic tests, because apparels could be bad for them. So I think there's definitely some play with the bolter girls because of this rule that they get on their datasheet. Social studies teacher, I'll answer your question at the end, and I already talked about sisters and troops. So later on, if you go back and watch, you can get the answer to that. But okay, so those are special rules. There are not a lot of them. Let's talk points. Okay, so the Rhino, we'll start with the Rhino. Rhino is standard Rhino points, 75 points, 5 points for the Hunter Killer Missile. I think the Rhino's days are over. They just don't want to get rid of the models and squat them entirely. But, you don't see Rhinos these days, and for a reason. But interestingly enough, 75 points is probably too many points for its stat line. Because it literally is just a box that moves and has no other thing going for it. Doesn't fight, doesn't really shoot. So probably Rhinos and drop pods need a rewrite or extra things if you want people to use them. But it's the only thing that we have, so, it is what it is. Yeah, like I said, it's maybe just about cheap enough to consider trying a few of them in a list of niche performance, but 75 points is quite a lot for the Rhino. And it's gone up and down over the editions, but at 75 points right now, it's a little bit costly. Okay, let's talk about bolter girls. The prosecutors, they are the basic girl. There's 12 points each, which makes a unit of 5 of them cost 60 points. Now, that is the cheapest thing in the Talon's Codex. That is literally the cheapest unit that we have. And so if you're looking for a cheap infantry unit to do stuff, they're there. So you can't get any cheaper than that. And other than the elite slot messing you up, that's what they're there for. This would be really good if they were troops, because it's something that we need. And at 60 points, it would be splashable. I mean, 2 units, basically, you can get 2.5 units of girls for the cost of 1 guardian unit. So if you imagine your battalion, 3 by 3 guardians, and now you've got, 2, 3, 6, 7 to 8 girl units, sisters units instead, that changes the game for us, right? So, and this is probably why they didn't make them troops. So, we'll see what happens in the future, but, the points is, comparisons to like our basic guardians is there. And obviously, so if you take a unit of girls for 60 and the Rhino, that's 135 points, which is still less than a guardian unit. So, that's the comparison there. Okay. I think 12 points is too much, maybe by 1 or 2 points. And we'll talk about this when we go to the comparators, but I think we're paying too much of a premium for their little bit of anti-psycherness. And it's paying too much. And it's interesting how many points GW kind of gives that. So they obviously, you pay a premium for psychers. I mean, just ask Grey Knight players. They pay huge premiums for their units to be psychers. And so we pay a premium for these to be anti-psychers, although we get a lot less out of it by being anti-psychers than psychers get out of being psychers. And so I think 10 or 11, probably 10, is a more fair price for the basic bolter sister. It just seems like they haven't really paid much attention to their points and never really thought about adjusting it. Now, Vigilators are the sword sisters. And what's crazy about this is we already talked about how the swords are almost as good as Guardian Spears. Well, you pay 5 points for the swords, which I feel like having weapon skill 3, having only 2 attacks base, that and a lower strength, that the 5 points for these swords is too much. And so I think if Vigilators, instead of being 17 points, again, were like 14, 15 points, it would be much more palatable. So I think Sword Girls are definitely overpriced. The Flamer Girls are ridiculously overpriced. They are 18 points. So you're paying 6 points for a bog standard Flamer, which is just really bad. In my opinion, the Flamer, the Witch Seeker Girls should be the same cost as the Bolter Girls, just you choose Bolters or Flamers. That should be, those 2 sheets should be consolidated. You choose either Flamer or Bolter, and if you choose Bolter, you get Prosecutor Rule. I think that would be way better. The Flamer Girls are just way overpriced at 18 points. Okay, so keep that in mind, that I think that Bolter Girls should be around 10 to 11 points. Okay, now, comparables. So this is an interesting section. So how do we compare these? Well, I don't really feel like it's fair to compare them to other elites, because they're not really elite, and they will not compare to other elites in other factions. So we're not going to compare them to elites. We're going to compare them to the kind of role that they play in our army, which is as troops, basically. So we're going to compare them to other factions' troops and see how they do. And always remember, with this comparison, of course, is that they're not troops. Okay, let's compare them to the humble tactical Marine. So Marines now, of course, are 18 points. They are T4, 2 wounds now, move 1 inch less, 3 up save. Of course, that would be a decent comparator because they're 12 wounds compared to 18 wounds. Not a good comparator for the Flamer Girls, but for the normal Bolter Girls, it's a decent comparator, 6 points cheaper, but you have to remember now that they also got Bolter Discipline, which makes their shooting much better. They have Shock Assault, which gives them more attacks. And then they have a whole bunch of other rules. So really, 12 points is still too much. Again, 10 to 11 points, I think, is a fair comparator to the humble tactical Marine. So comparing them to strike squads from Grey Knights is difficult because one is Psyker and one is anti-Psyker, but they're 20 points each, those Grey Knight strike squads. So you're paying a higher cost for Psyker than anti-Psyker. Of course, they're like normal Marines in terms of stats, and they get all these other things, and they generally have better shooting and better combat weapons too. So, it's a tough comparison to make, and arguably, Grey Knights may be slightly expensive too. Okay, let's compare these sisters to Battle Sisters from Adeptus Sororitas. So the basic Battle Sister is T3, same as us, 1 wound, same as us, 3 up armor. They don't have any psychic rules. They have the same bolter, and they have a bunch of other rules to do with being in the Sisters Codex. But they're only 11 points. They're basically the same, and they're cheaper by 1 point. So these guys should be cheaper. So there's good comparison. Guardsmen. So guardsmen are your other kind of T3 1 wound infantry. They are of course only 4 up save, hit and weapon skill ballistic skill 4, and so they're obviously a lot weaker, and they're only 5 points. So are they kind of like 60% weaker than sisters? I don't know. But it seems to point to me that the sisters would be better priced at 10 to 11 points. Skitarii Rangers are 9 points, almost exactly the same stat line, but with a 4 up save, weapon skill 4, and way better weapons. 9 points. Dire Avengers are 11 points, and they're basically identical, except they have 1 less attack and a 4 up save, and Shrieking Catapults are way better than an unaltered bolter. The Eldar Guardians are only 8 points. They're basically the same as Dire Avengers, but only have a 5 up save. So there you go. And they're a lot cheaper, 3 points less. Cabalite Warriors, topical. But Cabalite Warriors are only 8 points, and they're basically identical again, except for 4 up save. And now they got lots of rules, and the Splinter Rifles are poison weapons. So, only 8 points, 4 points cheaper than our girls. Drukhari Witches, basic troop melee units. If you compare them to our sword girls, witches are 10 points each compared to 17 for our sword girls. They have 3 + 1 attacks base compared to our 2, double the number of attacks. Of course, they only have 6 up save, but you can take way more of them, and they're almost half the price. They move 8 inches, which is faster, and they have the same weapon skill. So witches at 10 points. Harlequin troops are 14 points, so 2 points more. But Harlequin troops are very flexible. First of all, they move 8 inches. They can jump around. They have 4 attacks base, double R's. Only a 6 up save, but they often have a whole bunch of invulns. And they can either be made into melee with the addition of a few points, bringing them up to 18 or 19 points. Or they can do some shooting. So very flexible troops. Necron Warriors are 13 points. Only 1 point more. They have better shooting, and they can come back to life. Orc Boys are 8 points. Tau Breachers are 9 points. Hormagaunts, 6 points. Termagants, 5 points. GSC Acolytes, with all their combat potential, only 8 points. And Neophytes, which is kind of like Guardsmen, 6 points. And for whatever reason, Brood Brother Guardsmen are more expensive than normal Guardsmen. So all those things are good comparators to look at when you're thinking about how pricey our sisters are. So overall, when I look at all these things and what these units do compared to our girls, I stick by my guns that I feel like these girls should be max 10 points. Flamer girls should be 10 points with weapon choice, and the swords maybe 3 or 4 points on top of that. Okay. Let's talk about stratagems. So they have a page of their own stratagems, which is very cool. And so we're going to look at them now. So the first stratagem is Empiric Severance. So this is a stratagem which lets you stop a psychic power on 3 up after deny attempts. So this is obviously super powerful. Again, limited by this 18-inch bubble thing, which is the big limiter. But if you're in that bubble and you really need to stop power, and you have other strats that let you try and deny, you can certainly use this strat and you stand a decent chance of stopping it outright. So that's a good strat, and that is a strat that plays right into their psychic protection sort of role. And I'm glad they made it, but 3-up instead of 4-up makes it the best version of that in the game. So that's good. That pays, homage to what they're supposed to be doing. So the only area of cross interaction between Sisters and Custodes is this stratagem called Talons. And basically what you have to do is you have to have a Custodes unit fight or shoot, and then if your girl unit is within 6 of that unit, they get to reroll hits. So I guess that's okay. It's only 1 CP, and the only time I can really see this like coming into like your consciousness is like if you got sword girls and they're mixed in combat next to a custodian unit or a Custodes unit, and you fight with the Custodes unit first, and now so that your sword girls can reroll hits. And so there is that synergy, and that's nice. I can't see this really doing much for shooty girls because they're not going to be in the same place as you, and definitely flamers, it doesn't even matter. So it's like, yeah, I feel like this is really for sword girls who are mixed up in combat with their custodian comrades, in which case then you're hitting on 3s with rerolls, and then you're wounding with +1 to wound, as we'll see later, and then you're doing a bunch of damage. So in that case, like a brick of sword girls could be useful to do some damage. Of course, they're just going to die in response, but then they're hitting your girls and not your Custodes units. So I think the Talons stratagem, while circumstantial, could be good if you set it up that way. Okay, punishment fire we talked about already. It turns your bolters into assault 3 18-inch, which is good and useful for shooting psychers combined with the prosecutor rule. Okay, Desperation's Price. Again, a circumstantial stratagem if you set it up perfectly. Again, 18-inch range. The Psyker has to peril first, which your own ability doesn't make them do because peril is only on natural rolls of 2 or 12. So your own being in the 18-inch aura doesn't make them peril more often. But if they do peril and you're there and you have a CP, you can do extra mortals. Sure, that's great if it happens. It's just so rare that that's going to happen, by virtue of perils being pretty rare. So yeah, not super good. All right, I think the best stratagem they have actually is Creeping Dread. So this may be the only stratagem that I feel that you should save CP for if you're playing Sisters. This gives an enemy unit within 6 inches -1 to hit, either shooting or combat. There's not a lot of -1 to hit in combat. And just ask aggressors how shitty it is to go from 3-up to hitting on 4-up in combat, right? It really does suck. And so -1 to hit in combat is super strong and can make a big difference to your survivability. And so this stratagem alone is why I wish we could take Aleya by herself or have an HQ sister, so we can just park a character behind the front line, can't be targeted, gives us some psychic stuff, and allows us access to Creeping Dread. That would be so good. As it is, on a unit of Sisters, unless you're playing sword girls and getting them mixed up, you're probably never going to get this off on anybody unless they're making a backline defense and they need to somehow survive being charged. So yeah, but if you're running sword girls, this is definitely something to save CP for. And so now if you have a block of sword girls, you're going in there, you're making the retaliation -1 to hit, you're doing Talons to make yourself re-rolling the hit, you're +1 to wound. Like, you could see that working into some kind of gimmick for sure. Okay, Decapitating Strikes. Again, if you're running sword girls, then you have this stratagem, Decapitating Strikes. Okay, Purgation Sweep. Decapitating Strikes is +1 to wound. So +1 to wound for the sword girls in combat is great. It takes strength 5. It in effect increases their strength quite markedly. It's better than increasing the strength, and so it's fine. Okay, Purgation Sweep. So this is another stratagem. So basically, it turns your flamer girls into at least 4 hits. So you roll it and it's at least 4, which is fine. 4 is the average, though. Remember that. So you're just using CP to get you to the average, which is annoying. But it's pretty good, except that the flamers suck. And if you want to run a block of them to do more flamer, then that's 2 CP. So yeah, I just think like it just kind of sucks. And these days, this stratagem written in 9th for some of the newer codexes coming out would say auto 6 hits, not 4 hits. Just saying. So that already seems like this stratagem is kind of shitty. Okay. And the last stratagem is immaterial dissonance. So again, a tricky little strat to get off. You got to hit something with a psycho grenade. It has to be a demon or a psyker, obviously. And it will give them -1 to hit for the rest of the turn. So that's pretty good. But it's like, okay, so if it's your turn and you hit them with a psycho grenade, which you have to be within 6 inches to do, you could do, I guess, if you're just behind your front line, and then you're in combat with them with your Custodes, and now they're -1 to hit. So, like, if all these conditions are true, answer yes, then sure, this 1 CP is kind of good. The other situation is Overwatch, but of course, nobody's spending CP to Overwatch with freaking psycho grenades where you're fishing for a 6 just to hit with 1. So that's just not good. So overall, the stratagem is probably not good. And if you have Creeping Dread, you don't really even need this stratagem, because then you don't even depend on hitting with a psycho grenade. You can just do it. And it's still 6 inches. So this stratagem kind of useless. Okay, so list building. Okay, so list building for sisters, unfortunately, you have to give that some thought. You got to almost build around it a little bit because they take up elite slots. We've already talked about it at length. Lots of people like to run dreadnoughts nowadays, which basically means you can't run sisters unless you're running battalion, and so you're paying HQ and troop tax. And so otherwise, like, unless you plan around it, you probably won't find putting sisters in your list that useful. If you are running sisters, you're running generally minimum units of 5 bolter girls plus or minus a rhino. And if you have the points, you could even try the melee sword girls trick. I haven't tried it personally, but generally most people are kind of running min units with rhinos. I feel that the rhinos do add a lot of value for the sisters. It protects them. You start off in them to be protected, and then you just come out in the first turn. You get an extra 3 inches of movement. It makes them mobile to get to the mid-board. It can give you that early mid-board presence that you don't have. Helps you get things like engage, leaving sisters in the backfield. Your rhino goes up. Move blocking, especially with heavier terrain density these days. Move blocking is very useful. Bad touching things is still useful. Charging things, maybe eating Overwatch, who knows. Getting onto midfield objectives, just generally being a nuisance and requiring your opponent to spend that little bit of firepower to take them down. If they die, no big deal. You just lost a rhino. Even if you run 4, you're not giving up good secondary points for that. And if they end up surviving to turn 4, turn 5, nobody's killing those rhinos. And now they can be getting you like line breaker and all those kind of things, and harassing your opponent's line. In the games that I've played, only one game against Salamanders did I lose. I was running two units of girls and 2 rhinos at the time. That was the only game where I lost both rhinos. At least 1 rhino, often 2, survived every other game I played with them, because nobody wanted to put firepower into the rhinos, and it became just annoying to deal with later in the game. And the girls were very good at doing their job, holding backfield, maybe moving up to the middle. In that one game against Death Guard, it did help me with psychic defense. And I never used banners, but they got me some scramblers, and so that they can be useful like that. So let's talk about play styles. Okay, so how do you use sisters? So I think you use sisters in the following ways, and if people have other ways of using them, please let me know. Number 1, the standard backfield objective holders and actions. So a cheap infantry, can't get any cheaper than 60 points for us. You leave them at the back on your backfield objective or objectives, hidden, behind, obscuring, and they can raise banners. They can do home field and sometimes midfield scramblers if you have a rhino. 60 points definitely feels better to leave at the back doing nothing all game than 150 points. And in cover, as I already mentioned, they can survive quite a lot of this second thought leftover firepower that gets thrown at them, especially if they're far on a long table. And but if they do get charged from deep strikers in your own backfield, they will die. So just be careful about that. They're also very good at screening your backfield from deep strike because there's 2-inch coherency. They can move 7 inches. And so you cover a lot of space with just 5 girls. And then you add the Rhino in and you've got your whole backfield screened. So I think they do fulfill this role very well if you have the elite slots and points for them, backfield holders, and actions. Okay, so number 2 is as action junkies. So as infantry, they can do a number of actions. So obviously they can do banners. So if you have 2 units sitting on 2 objectives, that's probably 9 to 10 banner points at the end of the game if you protect your backfield. Scramblers, so they can obviously get your home scramblers, and if you pop it in a Rhino, they'll probably get you the midfield scramblers. You could infiltrate up to 2 units of sisters for 1 CP because they're so cheap power-wise. And so they could come into your opponent's backfield and do your 3rd scramblers. So I did do that in a couple of games, and I just didn't like spending the CP to infiltrate them. But that is a viable game plan, and certainly along with your Alaris cap or whatever, you can use them to get line breaker, teleport home, or stuff like that. So there is use if you want to spend the CP to infiltrate them as well. So they're very good at doing those kinds of actions. Okay. Number 3, a mobile throwaway force. At the end of the day, 1 to 2 units of sisters and a couple of Rhinos does not cost you a lot of points. And they can eat up some early firepower, move you up the board, and get you some early midfield presence, which we often don't have. And then they'll likely die. In the meantime, they may make psychic stuff for your opponent slightly more troublesome, but probably not significantly more troublesome. And then if they die, they die. No big deal. Doesn't cost you any secondaries, like nothing. And then a single Rhino, as I already mentioned, can do so much. I won't go into all again, but a single Rhino surviving can be a real pain in the ass. And then again, if it dies, it dies. No big deal. So I think they're very good as an expendable part of our army, something that we cannot say because every other wound on our Custodes models counts and hurts when we lose them. Number 4, Rhino Rush. Does it work? Can we run 3 or 4 Rhinos with no sisters and just run them around, engage, midfield, tagging, move blocking, bad touching, holding the back? You probably could. It's something I'm going to try. If anything, just to use all the stupid Rhinos I have from 7th. But I think that's an interesting concept, kind of a Rhino Rush component to your list, just using no maiden Rhinos. Number 5, Vigilator block. So a meaty block of 5 to 10 sword girls, almost compulsory to put them in a Rhino, just like Repentia. The Rhino delivers them. They get extra 3-inch movement so they can make their charge. They move 7 inches, so that's already 10-inch plus 2d6 strat range. And as we already mentioned, you can use Talons, you can use Decapitating Strikes, reroll wounding against Psychers. So there's definitely some play with a large block of sword girls. If they get hit back, you can use Creeping Dread to -1 to hit the enemy, and so maybe they may not completely get smushed, but they probably will be completely smushed. That's only 10 wounds right there. So you're like, 170 points for 10 wounds feels really bad. It is really bad. 10 wounds that are T3, 3-up save. So it's like, that's probably not super viable, but it might be fun to try out if you happen to have sword girls lying around, which I definitely do not. So, Vigilator block. Okay, Psychic Protection. So, we double back now to Psychic Protection. Are they really good Psychic Protection? Well, yes and no. By themselves, 1 or 2 units with an 18-inch aura of Psychic Abomination against good Psychic Army players will do nothing. Literally nothing. You'll never use their stratagems, and that's usually no. It's not a good reason to take the girls. However, I think that later in the game, if they are still alive and your army's in the midfield or beyond, now you start to hamper your opponent's psychic powers when they really matter later in the game. So there could be something to that. Second of all, as a combined Talons force, we have a lot of psychic protection now. Actually, more than most armies. Definitely more than people like Tau. So we have 18-inch Psychic Abomination auras, which adds -1 to 4 to cast and deny. We have a Stratagem that lets you deny on a normal roll. We have a Warlord trait that lets you deny with an extra +1. We have Fortress of Willpower, which lets a targeted unit just shut down the power on a 4-up. And that's after denies. And we have the Empiric Severance Stratagem, which lets you shut down after all those denies on a 3-up. And I believe you can actually use Fortress of Willpower and Psychic Empiric Severance on the same power if you really, really, really want to deny like that Doom or whatever. Which sometimes is that important to deny something like Doom or like Null Zone or, stuff like that. So we do actually have quite a lot of psychic protection. And like some psychic armies like to take things like psychic ritual secondaries. And so they want to park in the middle with their psyker. And so you don't have to move your sisters very far to start giving that guy -1, -2 to cast. And then you can start using your deny strats. And if you can deny him scoring like 5 secondary points with a CP, that is so worth it. And it screws their entire game. So I think there is play there, especially as a combined force. But you have to be prepared to spend some CP to protect yourself from psychics if that's what you want to do. So for sure, if you play in a psychic heavy meta, you probably worth you taking some sisters to help you with that. And in that way, the sisters help a lot more than a Calexis. Because a Calexis is just the Abomination aura, but doesn't really bring anything else to the table. They bring the 3-up deny, which is a key stratagem in terms of denial, and also they bring the stacking penalties. So I think if you play psychic heavy meta, then you should really think about it, because it does put a spanner in the wrench a lot of times as a whole force, not just as a single unit. Like, you can't expect a single unit of 5 girls to be the winner for you. But as a whole force, I think Talons does pretty well in that way. Okay. So overall, I think sisters have a role in our force. That role is probably minimal unless you really put them in purposefully because of the elite thing. But if you play in a psychic heavy meta, I think you should seriously consider throwing 1 or 2 units of sisters in your list. The other time where I seriously think people may struggle and sisters can help them is if they find themselves playing lists that are too elite with too few units, which is what I found myself doing a while ago. And by throwing 4 units into my list at minimum points, 2 units of girls and 2 rhinos, I was able to expand just the pure number of units in my army up to 11, 12 units, which made a huge immediate impact on my ability to hold ground, play the primary, and play the mission and secondaries. And so just by being cheaper and by being units, it can help us by giving us what we don't have, which is cheap units. And so I think there's a role there too. Now, I think the opportunity was missed by GW in trying to make the Talons. They didn't really integrate them at all. There's almost no synergy from sisters to Custodes or vice versa. Is a real missed opportunity. And so I hope that they can do something better with the Codex. And I don't mean just more strats or the random warlord trait. I hope we get an HQ, or at least let us run Aleya as an HQ by herself without having to take Christopher Walken. I hope they get made troop or some way that helps compensate for taking up elite slots. Maybe, as I've always said, I would love to see it like in the lore where we can just death watch 1 girl into a unit of custodians, maybe boost their psychic save to 5-up funeral pain or something, some token protection. It'd be cool if they bestowed psychic abomination, but anyway. And we can and that would be a great integration, and now we can access their strats too. But it would be nice if we had an HQ that we could just splash one HQ, or if there was some better integration, or maybe if Aegis bestowed a little bit onto them, or they gave a little bit of the psychic abomination to, like, it just needs to be a little bit more of a meaningful interaction between the two sides rather than just stuck on the side of the book. Okay. That brings us for the final 5 minutes. Sorry, running a bit late, on to Aleya. Okay, so Aleya is this girl. Her boyfriend is Christopher Walken, aka Valerian, and they come as a couple. Couples only. They only come as a couple. You can't get them separately. Once they're on the field, they can run around, they can go seek other opportunities, but you have to buy them as a couple, and they are 200 points. 200 points. That's a lot. Okay, so the biggest issue is that you have to buy them together, because who's Christopher Walken? He's a shitty shield captain. He is, he gives you the captain reroll, which normal captains do. He's strength 7 instead of strength 6, but captains can take axes, and he can reroll something one time per battle. That's it, one time per battle, and then he's out. And so he's really pretty shitty. But let's assume out of that 200 points that Christopher Walken costs like 100, 110 points, like a normal captain. That means you're paying 80 or 90 points for a Sister of Silence. Okay, and so what are you getting for her for 80 or 90 points? That's crazy points. The normal Sister of Silence is 12 points. So what are you getting for her? You're getting standard Sister stat line. Completely standard, except that her weapon skill is 2, and she has 4 attacks instead of like 3 from a Sister Superior, which is not super great for, 8 times the points. She has no invuln, 3-up save, and she has no other rules. She has the standard Sister's Abomination and stuff. She has no other rules. Nothing. And her sword is worse than the Vigilator's sword. It's worse than the Vigilator's sword. Her special Somnus Blade, or whatever it's called. It's just horrible rules writing. And that's disregarding the fact that we couldn't actually use them legally in a match play game until recently. So it just doesn't work. Now, I tell you what though, if we could take her standalone without Christopher, and obviously don't pay 80, 90 points for her, but let's say you have to pay 80 points for the privilege of taking Aleya by herself without the boyfriend. You're paying a premium to ditch the boyfriend. Would that be worth it? It might be. It might be. Then 20 points more than like a Sister's unit. It might be for the psychic protection, because now she can move up and not get targeted. She can stand beside the Telemon or whatever, stand beside your shield bros, not be targeted. She gives her 18-inch aura, but she can move up with impunity. And now she brings Creeping Dread to the front line. So that may be worth it in and of itself if, let's say, she was 80 points and you could ditch Christopher Walken. But you can't do that. So we'll see what happens. Maybe she gets included in our book along with Valerian. Maybe they get integrated in our codex. Who knows? But even if they did, but they stayed the same, it wouldn't be worth it. Okay. So that's it, guys. Let's go to questions on the Discord here. If you got questions in chat, please post them in. Okay, here we go. Okay, what is the best way to utilize rhinos with sisters? So there we did talk about it, and there's lots of neat things to do with rhinos. So do answer that already. Okay, is there any reason to use squads larger than 5? We answered that already. Can sisters reliably babysit a backfield objectives while more expensive units get work done further up? I think they totally can. I think you just have to screen them from getting backstabbed for a period of time, and then they can sit on the back for the rest of the game. If your opponent's getting to them, then probably you're already losing. So they totally can. And in fact, that's one of the things that they do well. Depends on the matchup, blah, blah. Okay, with so many armies bringing 1 to 2 Psychers nowadays with plus to cash, should we be taking 1 or 2 units of Sisters or doubling up on anti-Psyker and melee deterrence with Calexis? So there's a lot of questions about comparing the Calexis to Sisters unit. Personally, I'd rather pay a little bit more and have a Sisters unit and a Rhino than have a single Calexis. Calexis is not Psychic Defense. The Sisters do Psychic Defense way better, especially as integrated, as I already said, with a Talon's Force. The Calexis is really for things like you just want to sit them on the back, or if you want to do like secondary shenanigans by deep striking. I don't think the Calexis is a worthwhile Psychic Deterrent, just one model by itself. And so I already said probably 1 to 2 units of Sisters. Thoughts on Sisters of Silence, Charon Pattern Acquisitor being used as a Sisters of Silence Rhino. I believe that's their little like camera lens transport vehicle thing. So I've never seen that in person. I don't know how big it is. Obviously, in a casual game, who cares? But in a tournament game, if your thing doesn't have the same size profile as this, I don't think you should do that. Thoughts on if the Sisters would be better for our Custodes as 2 separate codexes or... So, yeah. So, we already talked about that extensively. Just dreaming. What about being able to include one? So, yeah, we talked about that already. Last call for... Sisters versus Calexis versus Custodes allies. Yep. So, we talked about that. Aleya and Valerian just ranted about that, Chris. Have you ever seen any particular good counts as Sisters? So, probably any female models. I mean, Raging Heroes makes a lot of like overly sexualized but female models. There's a lot of third-party female models out there you could probably use. I mean, yeah, it's just important that you get them about the same size, and these are pretty small. So, but yeah, I don't know them offhand, but certainly you could look into that. Okay, there was a question in the chat. I'll just scroll up. Do you think Sisters getting the Acquisitor from 30k would be a buff to them? So, like, I don't know anything about the Acquisitor in 30k. I don't play 30k, and obviously the rules in 30k have nothing to do with 40k, so I don't know. I mean, if they get the Acquisitor and it's actually good, then sure, but they kind of gave them the Rhino, so they could have given us rules for the Acquisitor already. So I don't know. I don't see that happening. Okay, 6 points or in talent makes Sisters HQ. Bigger than Rhino, has multi-melta, 14-inch. Yeah. So, it's like, okay, if they give you the Acquisitor, and it's got a bunch of weapons that kind of suck, or, weapons that we already have in other places and we don't need to take a transport for it, right? So it's the same question, right? So it would really depend on the rules. It's impossible to answer that question. Okay. So we run a bit over. Thanks very much for watching, everybody. Thank you for tuning in, following, subscribing. Thank you to our patrons. Thank you for our Discord community, which is always excellent. Please let me know what you feel about this episode. And next week, tune in. It's on Tuesday night where we interview with Steve Jall from 40K Game Changers. And I hope everybody enjoyed that. And have a good night.